When did you start challenging what charity actually is? Because for me, it began when a mentor of mine who is an African themselves lent me a book called When Helping Hurts. In this book, I began to read about a framework of charity that isn't toxic, that actually empowers the people it's designed to. And why do we need to talk about charity? Well, poverty rates are on the rise. When we look at statistics, for example, in Ghana, it's about 21.9%. In Australia, it's 14.2%. And globally, we're looking at 18.3% of the population. Whether we're looking at the quote-unquote developing world or the quote-unquote developed world, there are conditions within each country which are creating poverty. In a place like Ghana, we're looking at issues such as health insurance, nutrition, overcrowding, and sanitation. And then when we're looking at Australia, for example, we're looking at issues like rental stress, the housing crisis. And globally, we have a mixture of all of these things and more. So in this climate, we have a need for public good, public programs, social and community services that assist people during some of the hardest conditions of their life. First, let's actually look at the sector within which charity operates: social and community services, philanthropy, aid and development. I'm going to speak to the Australian context as I myself have been a worker within the social and community sector sphere, starting off as a volunteer, as many people do and still do. Within Australia, the social and community services workforce is quite large. Approximately 300,000 people are employed by this sector. If you're thinking about what job titles encompass this, it can include support workers, counsellors, social workers, case managers, and many other roles. What I'm about to say can also apply to your big multinational, multilateral, organizations like the UN, UNICEF, and other renowned organizations that have a focus on development. Roles include things to do with monitoring and evaluation, program officers, country leads, country directors. If you've ever wanted to work within the UN infrastructure, you know the kind of roles we're talking about. So looking at how Australia has defined this sector, social and community services encompass a wide range of programs and activities to improve the lives of individuals. Services usually involve a highly non-government sector workforce delivering care and support to clients facing adversity, particularly those at risk of poverty and disadvantage. And so we're thinking these are very necessary roles in our society. They address very real systemic issues. What's the harm in that? When we look at the organizations that are implementing these activities and programs, a large proportion of them are non-government organizations, which comprise non-profit organizations. Now, these non-profit organizations in many cases rely on state and federal funding for their activities. And while some of these organizations may have the luxury, the good fortune, the privilege of being larger and well-resourced, many of these organizations are actually very dependent on this government funding and lack their own financial reserves, meaning that they operate within these short-term cycles of budgets that may last a year, up to 3 years, maybe in good cases more, but continued funding is not guaranteed and there's a lot of uncertainty. In a previous video, we said that Africa doesn't need more entrepreneurs, but when we actually delve deeper into that, we didn't say that entrepreneurship isn't needed, but we were questioning whether entrepreneurs should be addressing basic needs of the nation when it comes to infrastructure, healthcare, education. We can also see that governments have in some way shifted a lot of responsibility to NGOs to actually implement development agendas. While a lot of these non-profit, non-government organizations are not directly employed by the government, they are funded by the government, which means that they are very strategic to the government in the areas of major social initiatives, including homelessness, enabling access to justice and social security, protecting vulnerable children and young people, settling new migrants, promoting health, developing community resources, and more. When I read that book, When Helping Hurts, it opened my mind to actually assessing the work that I was involved in, programs, activities, funded for a set amount of time. My mentor challenged me to actually think about whether we could design programs, we could design initiatives, whether we could design and think about social impact in such a way that is indeed true charity and not what is termed toxic charity. Many of those working in this space have good intentions, and it was really interesting to read an article written by the Ghanaian British Afrobeat artist Fuse ODG, who had a song that I absolutely loved back in the day, who has been quite vocal in the space of the future of Africa and specifically as well looking at the development of African countries and portraying African countries in a light which is empowering and not disempowering and harmful. He was offered to join in the making of a song, and this was linked to a charity called Band-Aid, and he refused in the end to join in that song because when he received the lyrics shortly before recording them, those lyrics were portraying in his perception and in my perception too, harmful views of the African continent. He didn't dispute that the people involved had good intentions, but he was looking at the long-term impact of what was really a short-term project. This is also what can really get in the way of us reimagining the way that we empower others around us, empower ourselves, and achieve this empowerment through organizations, including charities, because then it becomes more about what's making us feel good and not about what's actually effective in practice in the context in which we are. I was reading a great quote from the CEO of the One campaign. It has been 140 years since imperialist powers gathered in Berlin for the scramble for Africa. Today, the power dynamics between the continent's 54 diverse nations and the rest of the world remain deeply imbalanced. Partnerships are often dominated by external actors and driven by their interests, not Africa's. But the dismantling of old models of development and cuts to traditional aid are a stark wake-up call for Africans to seize the reins of their own development, set their own priorities, speak with a united voice, and define the terms of partnership for shared growth. This requires that Africans move with decisive courage beyond donor-defined agendas, rebalance the table, and reclaim control over their social, economic, and strategic choices. This is an uncertain trajectory of being supported because that funding may be there today and gone tomorrow. Ken Opalo is writing in this article that these aid cuts are here to stay. They're just going to get worse. And so in that scenario, what do individuals do? What do communities do? What do nations do when most of this support is being provided external to the self? It also begs a philosophical question. Is charity truly empowering when the individual, the organization is not empowered itself? Terminology is also important, and in the article, Ken Opalo draws a distinction between development work and charity work. So while we're using all these terms fairly interchangeably in this video, when assistance is being provided, is it a situation where it's an emergency? In that case, charity might be the way to go. But if it's a non-emergency situation and these are conditions that communities, individuals have been dealing with for a prolonged amount of time, then development would be the way to go. And so Ken Opalo observes that a lot of the time within this sector, within this industry, these two things, charity and development, are conflated. Transformative change cannot take place because true empowerment is not being afforded. And when we look at true empowerment, that means taking a long-term view rather than a short-term view, which is what emergency situations do require. So let's be clear here, we're not talking about removing charity in emergency situations, but we're looking at challenging charity in situations where we need to work with individuals, work with communities, work with nations so that they are taking the reins of their own development and long-term prosperity. What is the way forward? How can social and community services, how can development be done differently in a way that is true and empowering and not toxic and disempowering and encouraging dependency. I want to return to the book I read, When Helping Hurts. In that book, I was introduced to this concept of true charity. Now, it could also be rephrased as true development. According to this concept, the best form of charity is one, voluntarily resourced, which means it's provided by people who actually care about that particular issue, about that particular community, about that particular individual. Secondly, it's challenge oriented, and this is where the key part of true charity really comes through, and that means that it leverages relationships and accountability to challenge recipients to help themselves. Thirdly, it is outcome driven, which means it achieves long-term measurable results. This concept of true charity is then further described by providing a number of key concepts. A few that I decided to sit with are the development requires challenge. I really found this to be at first a bit confronting because as being someone who's been on the other end of receiving support and assistance, I had a bit of a attitude of like, okay, but if people need help, why are we requiring them to do something if they're in a vulnerable situation? And then as I read this book and as I reflected, I looked back at the moments when I felt most empowered when I received assistance. And often that was because I had a role. It is about give and take, and it's also about affirming the inherent dignity of the individual. And we gain dignity when we can flourish, when we have responsibility, when we have accountability. This also humanizes the recipient of any kind of aid or support. Reiterating that this happens outside of emergency situations. This is looking at where people are looking for long-term support or they need long-term support. This flows nicely to the second concept, which is transformational programs see people in poverty as peers, not projects. And in this book, just a little disclaimer if you read it, it does use the phrase poor people, which is distasteful, honestly, but that's what the book uses. So if that comes up, like just be aware that that's what they're using. This concept is all about creating reciprocal relationships, really leveling the playing field in a way where the person actually receiving the support is receiving a support that is going to empower them to be able to give that support to themselves in the long term. You're working with people, you're not imposing things on them, having this top-down approach. It's leveling the playing field. It really promotes starting with the knowledge, the dreams and desires that come from the individuals and the communities themselves. Starting with that, rather than coming in with a pre-planned agenda, a pre-written program and initiative, and then expecting the buy-in. Whatever kind of change that you want to make, if it's change that is being co-designed, and then in that co-design, those involved are able to tell their friends, and that support is able to reach more people, it's more likely to gain traction because it's actually designed by the people it's for. And then the third concept that stood out to me was that we must measure long-term results, not just activity. And so this really ties us back neatly to this idea that when we're looking at a lot of activities and programs within the social and community services sector, we are often looking at budget rounds that are only going to last a few years. And so that means when those budgets end, that means that the programs and activities end. And so if there is not enough resources, if this hasn't been designed in such a way that people can take ownership, people can continue on the work themselves for themselves, then are we actually harming more than we're helping? Some of these programs and initiatives do really engender a lot of dependency on the people that they support. And so when they're gone, it can be this really sharp, hard withdrawal or something that was quite meaningful. Sometimes we can just have an initiative, we can put on a program, we can run some activities, and we don't measure the impact, the effectiveness. We don't always see follow-up as well. We see these initiatives happening and we hear of all these high numbers, but we don't actually know what that means in practice because those great positive results may be short-term results. not actually long term. And then that means that whatever intervention was done might actually be harming more than it's helping. And so some of these longer term measurements that true charity supports is looking at a person or a community's stable housing, employment, education, family dynamics, and also even the intangible impacts beyond what is immediately apparent, such as measuring with the right tools, knowledge, motivation, and social connectedness. Africa is very much set to be impacted by charity, by development, by social and community services that are not well thought out, that do not have the long-term interests of these individuals or countries at the fore. I want to share a quote that Apollo shares that's from Zainab Usman, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of Carnegie's Endowment Africa Program. Proponents of global development now face a choice. They can wait for attitudes in donor countries to shift back towards support for foreign aid at some point in the distant future, or they can reimagine the entire concept of global development, detaching it from aid and rooting it instead in industrial transformation, helping countries shift from subsistence farming, informal employment, and primary commodity production toward manufacturing and services. In truth, the aid industry was already adrift. Its interventions had become spread too thin and often failed to address the key obstacles that poorer countries faced as they tried to upskill their workers, build energy and transport infrastructure, and access new markets. And Apollo lists two things which he considers are the most important things to get right regarding the future of the aid industry. One of those is to understand the nature of the problem that we are trying to fix. We need to pose the question, how do we deliver development aid and humanitarian assistance in a manner that helps countries along in their journeys towards structural economic change and which does not entrench aid dependency? The second right thing to do, in Apollo's opinion, is to have a clear sense of what success looks like. What are actually the objectives of aid? One of them, in Apollo's perspective, specifically speaking to the African context, is to facilitate the strengthening of state capabilities in the provision of essential public goods and services. Because remember, as we mentioned previously, where we're outsourcing this to under-resourced NGOs, this is not going to create the massive scale transformation that's required for the future. And then secondly, to help catalyze private sector growth and mass job creation within large firms. Now, you might not agree with all of these points, but I do think that, as we know here, it's going to give us food for thought and lots of food for conversation. Apollo also says reframing the way that we do aid, reframing the way that we do development actually requires what he terms a conceptual leap. This conceptual leap must be characterized by a willingness to let aid recipients and their policymakers be the masters of their own destiny. And we know this is specifically important within the context of the African continent, which right now we know there is aid dependency. We know that there is foreign debt. Ken also reaffirms this idea of the way forward is actually by giving people agency, by giving people responsibility. Aid recipients must always be on the driver's seat as far as research, policy making, and implementation go. Whenever we're receiving things and that's being all set and led and implemented by people that are not necessarily from within these communities where these issues are taking place, they are not directly affected. They can be well-meaning. They are definitely essential. We need dialogue, we need collaboration, we need partnerships, but we also need our own selves, our own people to be making that. And you know what? We're going in the right direction, because I know that I have met some incredible people over the past 2 months I've been in Ghana who are really doing work that I would say is empowering and not creating a dependency. And I think that's the strength of us as a young generation. Hughes also writes in his 2024 article, "I hope that in decades to come, Africans will provide the primary solutions to our own challenges, but when short-term humanitarian fundraising is needed, it should be approached with dignity, led by Africans lens and with thoughtful consideration for its long-term impacts. I really appreciate you guys for watching. I'd love to know what you think. Do you work in the community social services sector, international aid or development? What are your opinions about this kind of topic? Do you think that international aid, development, local aid and development creates dependency? What do you think is a model for true empowerment? What do you think is the future of this kind of work? I'd love for us to continue the conversations in the comments. Madasipa Yeveshia. I'll see you in the next video. And until then, take care. Talk soon.